Alright students, welcome to another primary source walkthrough. This week we are talking about World War I and some of the internal struggles during that same time frame. So this primary source is about that latter part of the chapter where, this is not necessarily World War I, this is more about, what's going on in the country during that war. And this actually happens a few years after the war. The war ends in 1918. This happens in 1921. Well, one of the things that the chapter points out is that right around 1918, 1919, 1920, 1921, there were quite a few race riots in this country. The chapter talks about a bit about the East St. Louis race riot in 1919. It talks about a riot in Chicago where the National Guard had to come in after a black man crossed an invisible line on a beach and sent the white people who were on the white beach into an absolute frenzy. And there's Tulsa. And the reason why I selected this is because in the wake of the George Floyd shooting and the Jacob Blake shooting and this attention to a lack of understanding of American history, a lot of people identified that they had never heard of the Tulsa riot before. And that's compounded with the fact that one of the most popular television programs over the summer, the end of the spring, beginning of the summer, was Watchmen on HBO. And if you watched Watchmen, you know that the opening scene of the series in the first episode is the Tulsa riot. And I thought it would be good for you to read a description of the event by somebody who was investigating it. So you get a sense of what does the historical record say about this riot. And so we have the report of a man named Walter White, who works for the NAACP, that is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, who has gone to Tulsa and is doing an investigation as to what happened. He's not an eyewitness, but he's taking eyewitness accounts. That's not to doubt that what he's saying is true. It's just a layer of things that we have to keep of in the source. Okay, so it's something to keep in mind. If you want to know precisely as much as you can about what happened in Tulsa, this is where you start, but then you need to read more and more and more sources, to really get the full picture. I'm only making you read this one. I think it's a really good one, and it'll explain what caused this riot and what the consequences were. Now, one thing I have to say, the definition of race riot here is a little different than the one that we use now. Typically, when we say race riot in 2020, what we mean is that a group of minority people are out in the street protesting, sometimes violently, their oppression. That is not what race riot means in 1921 or in 1919. When we're talking about race riots in the early 20th century, really, up until the 1960s, what we mean is white people visiting acts of violence on black people. That's what we mean. And that's what we're going to see in this report. So, I want you to read this in that context. This is a description of a race riot, meaning that white people visited acts of violence against black people. And we're going to try to figure out through this primary source, why did they do it? And what did they do to commit those acts of violence? So, here's what the report says. It opens by talking about a perceived action. Okay, a hysterical white girl related that a 19-year-old colored boy, it is a black man, attempted to assault her in the public elevator of the public office building in a thriving town of 100,000 people in open daylight. She went hysterical. Okay, she was screaming, she was doing all this stuff, and she said, "This black man touched me," and then the people lost their mind. Okay, they don't even say, "Well, we investigate this. We should see if this is true." It's just, nope, we're going to get our torches, we're going to get our guns, and we are going to visit terror on the black people of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, he says that as a result of this riot, somewhere between around 50 white men die, between 150 and 200 black people die, men, women, and children. There's a fire that burns $1.5 million worth of property. This is bad. It's bad news. So, he is going to give you a little bit of background on what's going on in Tulsa. He's setting up some of the tension. And what he's talking about here is he's saying, okay, look, this is a town. It's an oil town. There's all kinds of money here. We're talking $65,449,985.90 worth of money on December 19th, 1920. That's a lot of money. Okay, even in 2020 terms, that's a lot of money. But 100 years ago, that is an absurd amount of money. Okay? And the kinds of wealth that people are accumulating here is the kind of wealth that people were seeing out in California during the gold rush. And black people were a part of this prosperity. That caused resentment. There were white people in Tulsa who were not wealthy, who were very resentful of black people who were. They didn't feel, these white people, that these black men should have that wealth because that's what racism tells you. If you, as a white person, believe that the black American is a inferior human being because you're racist, well, then they shouldn't be wealthy, is what their logic is. So, when this happens, things really kick off. So, some of the other things. A lot of people thought that the black men and women of Tulsa were too radical. They were protesting Jim Crow cars. Okay? They were denouncing lynching, which is the extrajudicial murder of black people. They were saying we deserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, regardless of color. And for racist white people at the time, and even racist people now, when black people start asserting their rights, these racists get very upset, say things like, "Oh, these people are radical, or they're uppity, or they're something like that." So, black asserting their constitutional rights, and on top of that, the politics of the city are absolutely just abysmal. Okay? A vice ring's running the city. Okay? Organized crime is running this city. And there aren't even judges that are willing to do anything about it. No one's going to jail. No one's being held accountable for their crime. So it says down here, judges found more than 6,000 cases awaiting trial. Thus, in a county of approximately 100,000, 6 out of every 100 citizens were under indictment for some sort of crime, with little trial possible for them. So 6% of the population, he's saying, is under indictment for some sort of crime, and no one's doing anything about it. So he gives some examples, and in this case, there's a white man who is lynched, and nothing is done. Nothing is done. So, As he says, the net result of these conditions was that practically none of the citizens of the town, white or colored, had very much respect for the law. So it's kind of a Wild West, lawless place. So here's what happens. Here's where we get to the riot. Okay, she says that the boy grabbed her in the elevator. Oh, but then she changes her story. The boy just touched her arm. That's it. And then it was found afterward that all he had done was accidentally stepped on her foot. That's all that happened. But here, when white people in the Jim Crow South want an excuse to go after black people, their tried and true method is to say that there was a sexual assault. You are going to see, as we talk about further lynchings in this class, that usually the excuse. So when we talk about Emmett Till, that's exactly why the men who murdered him decided to murder him. He was black, and he got mouthy, quote unquote, with a white lady. He crossed some perceived sexual boundary. So they beat him, and they tried to hide his body by tying his body up to a big old man and throwing him in the river. We'll see that happen. We'll talk about it. So, that's that kind of sets things up. There's talking of lynching this young man, going out and hanging him from a tree. He assaulted this white girl. We got to hang him. That's what they're saying. And we also find out that Tulsa's segregated. There's this section of Tulsa that is white, and there's another section that is black. The black section has been known as Black Wall Street. There's lots of prosperity there. There's some tension. People are going. Black people are going to the sheriff and going, "Where's this lynch mob? You have to stop this lynch mob." And then the sheriff says, "There's no lynch mob." And the African Americans go back, but then they come back, and eventually things lose control. Somebody fires a shot, and then all hell breaks loose. That's what's going on here. And here's where things get really out of control. So around 5 o'clock Wednesday morning, the white mob, now numbering more than 10,000, made a mass attack on Little Africa, the black part of the city. Machine guns were brought into use, 8 airplanes going back and forth, and throwing out sticks of dynamite. That seems to be what has happened here. I find this line interesting. All that was lacking to make the scene a replica of modern Christian warfare was poison gas. It's kind of a nod to World War I, right? Where you're like, look, the only thing that is missing here from the scene of a World War I battlefield is the use of mustard gas. They're burning things down. Okay? White mob is carrying cans of oil. They loot the home. They take all of the money that they can find, all of the wealth out of the black section of town, and they burn everything to the ground. They're killing people left and right. 150 to 200 people, as the report says. This is a pretty dramatic thing. To say it's really stomach-churning to read. Here we learn about a doctor who has complied with the white order to kind of come with them, whatever. And they assured him, look, if you surrender, you won't be harmed, etc. And they shot him in the back of the head, killed him in cold blood. Just a doctor. Now, we find that the victims are laid in mass graves. There's no coffins. If the wealth is returned to black Americans from whom it was stolen, I think you know the answer, though. Of course it wasn't. Who was to take money away from white people and give it back to the black people? That wasn't happening. And, finally closes a comment and says, look, what are we going to do about this? This looks like the Russian Revolution. which it just, takes a couple years before. Like, we said that was too violent and awful, but what are we going to do? This is ridiculous. And he says there is a lesson in the Tulsa affair for every American who fatuously, wrongly believes that Negroes, quote unquote, will always be the meek and submissive creatures that circumstances have forced them to be during the past 300 years. You keep doing this to us, he says, essentially. We're not always going to just turn the other cheek. Eventually there will be violence. If you think back to what you read a couple of weeks ago, the Booker T. Washington speech and the W.E.B. Du Bois speech, I think you can imagine one of them, I think it's Du Bois, who would agree with that sentiment. I don't think Washington would. Washington would probably just say, "No, just do what the white people say and everything will work itself out." Du Bois would not say that. I imagine. Maybe he would. But based on everything I've ever read from the man, no. So, in any case, this is what a race riot looks like in 1920, or 1921 to be exact. You will see race riots appear again in the 1940s. I don't know how much the textbook in this new edition talks about the race riots during World War II, but we will talk about them, and maybe I'll have Dr. Esmacher come in and do a little guest spot and tell you about race riots during World War II, because that is her specialty. We'll see race riots again in the 60s, and we continue to see race riots. There are plenty of examples. So, all that said, we're going to wrap this one up. This one went a little long, but it is longer. We'll be back for another one soon, and if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks, guys.